So this is a conversation with some of my Jewish friends, and it has to do with Israel. So a lot of my Jewish friends think that they're supposed to support Israel, that Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people, and that to be a true Jew, you have to support the idea of the Jewish homeland, and therefore everything that just happens and is done by the Jewish government to preserve and protect Israel is fine. And I understand where they're coming from. I vehemently disagree with them. And I remember somebody recently said that Joe Biden is so old, he's older than Israel. Well, you know who else is older than Israel? I'm older than Israel. And I believe Donald Trump is older than Israel. He's younger than I am, so I'm not quite sure how old he is. But Israel hadn't always been around as a country. From my perspective, it's pretty much brand new. And the fact that in the Bible, it's discussed as the homeland of the Jews because God gave it to them. But if you've bothered to read the Old Testament, and I have, in the original Hebrew, no, I'm not. But I'm basically familiar with the main stories of the Bible. And if you read it, you understand that Moses was in Egypt with Jewish people. And God promised them a homeland, and the homeland was not where they were, it was another place. And guess who was in the other place? Other people were there. And the most miserable story in the Bible, from my perspective, is after Moses was dead, Joshua became the general in charge of the troops. He was leading the charge of the Israeli forces. And remember, these were just disparate tribes, but he had pulled them together under a common rubric and a common religion, a common value, to take the land of Israel away from the people who were living there. And there were all kinds of different people there, mainly under the general rubric of Arabs. And the strategy that they employed was one of absolute terror. And the most dramatic example of that was Joshua in the Battle of Jericho when the walls came tumbling down. Well, the walls didn't come tumbling down. But if you read the story of it in the Bible, what they did was Joshua found a woman inside Jericho who was willing to open the gates and let them sneak in at night. And they proceeded to come in and massacre every man, woman, and child. Jericho was a city. It wasn't a fort. It wasn't a fortress. It was a city. Very undermanned, underguarded, and they just went in and slaughtered everybody. Then they killed all the animals, and then they salted the ground so that nothing could grow there. And they did that to strike terror into the hearts of people every place else. So when Joshua's troops would arrive, everybody would be terrified, and they'd give up instantly and they'd flee. And that worked. And that was basically how the ancient Israelites took over that country and made it their own. Fast forward to David. I'm not going to go into all of his many transgressions, although he did beat the hell out of what was his name? The big guy. Instead, they went into combat with him, and instead of fighting sword to sword, David pulled out he had a .22 pistol with him, and he shot the guy in the head. Goliath, poor Goliath. He was fighting with a club, and David shoots him with a .22. What did David? Well, God gave it to him, obviously. So that's how David eventually becomes king, and yada yada yada. And he decides he's going to set up a kingdom, and he sets it up in Jerusalem. So most people today think the Jews built Jerusalem. They didn't build Jerusalem. It was there. It had been there for like 1,000 years. They went in, took it over militarily. I don't think there was much of a battle. And David said, "This is my kingdom, and this is my capital city, and like it or not, I'm here." Fast forward to the Romans and Jesus and the Diaspora and yada yada yada. and they were all run out of there by the Romans, roughly about the time of Jesus, which I don't know how long ago that was. I was just a kid at the time. So off they go. They're gone. No Jews there until they really came back at the time of the Suez Canal. And Benjamin Disraeli was the Prime Minister of England at the time. And he claimed to be of Jewish heritage, although he was a devout Christian. And he went through this kind of nonsense we're hearing from Christians today. Well, that's God meant that as the chosen land for his people, the Jews, so that the Christians could eventually come back there and then basically slaughter the Jews, and then the Christians would go to heaven after the battle of whatever that was. See, this is what happens when you get to be my age, 40. You forget things. Anyway, I started to say Sodom and Gomorrah, but it wasn't Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously. It's, it'll come to me. Anyway, the one they always talk about when the end of the world, where they have this big battle. Well, the place where they're going to have this big battle is actually a place in Israel. And it ain't big enough for a real battle, and I don't think they envisioned nuclear weapons at the time they were talking about that in the Bible. So, there we are. We fast forward. Benjamin Disraeli says, I'm building a Suez Canal. I want to make sure that we're going to be able to protect the Suez Canal, basically for our investors, but mainly for the English government. And he said the best way to do that is to take all the Jews that we have here in England and send as many of them as we can to Israel, so they can set up a base there for us, so that we have a friendly group of people to help us, so we can land our ships there in the event we have to defend the Suez Canal that we're paying for. That's when that whole movement of Jews into what's now Israel, really began. It began under Benjamin Disraeli. So that was back in the 1800s. Now we're fast forwarding again, end of World War II, and the Jews were treated miserably. There's no way you can exaggerate what happened to them from our friend Adolf. No, not the meat tenderizer guy, Hitler, the guy that, the Donald Trump of Germany. So the Donald Trump of Germany, Hitler, was rounding up Jews and exterminating them. Not a nice man. So now we have all of a sudden this movement afoot to give the Jews a homeland where they can say, this is our land. We have a right to be here. Nobody can throw us out. Nobody can throw us in extermination camps. This belongs to us, and we're entitled to live here in peace and freedom. Now that sounds great, and the world went for it. And then the United Nations said, we're going to, somebody introduced a resolution. And there's a lot of other history that went back in there. It was, British mandate Palestine and all that nonsense. But anyway, we fast forward to the 1948. Was it 40? It was 48. Of course, it was 1948. And 1948, the UN, there's a resolution introduced to make Israel a country in the eyes of the world. And the United States was prepared to veto that resolution. Look it up. Harry Truman said, I ain't signing that. I'm vetoing it. That night he was visited by the main fundraisers for the Democratic Party, all of whom were Jews. And they basically said, look, Truman, you're on a knife edge right now. You're poised to lose this election, probably bigger than anybody in history. And the only thing that could possibly save you is us and our money. You better support Israel, or we're not going to give you a nickel for your campaign. In fact, we'll support the Republican. So Truman, the next day, in an act of political courage, seldom seen, changed his position completely and signed and not only didn't veto, but the United States signed on to that resolution, and voila, Israel became a country, except the United Nations didn't have any way of enforcing that. They just said it. So the Zionists at that time said, yay, we're a country. Well, the Arabs didn't believe that. They didn't like it. And then this began the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflicts, which continue to this day. The problem, of course, is that, like in biblical times, there were people living there. The Palestinians weren't run out of there, and I'm using Palestinians in the generic sense. The Palestinians weren't run out of there by the Romans. The Jews were. Palestinians continued to stay there for thousands of years. There were people there that had families going backward generation after generation after generation. They had homes, they had businesses, they had agriculture, they had animals, they had all kinds of things. Now I'm not talking about the desert part, which nobody was living there, still isn't. I'm talking about the part where the people are now there, living there, mainly Jews. And so these people said, we're not going. Just because the United Nations says it's not our country doesn't mean it's not our country. It doesn't mean we don't have rights here. This is our land. These are our people. And Jews were coming from all over the world then to push these people out. And you had a terrible battle there. You had all kinds of people died. And from my perspective then, because I remember it happening at the time, I was just a kid, but I remember my parents were shocked at what was going on in Israel to the Arabs. Of course, we'd had, in my family, we didn't have a horse in that race. We didn't, it was like Jews, we don't, we're not like bound to one or the other. But what was going on was wrong. The people didn't have a right to come in from all over Europe and all over the world saying, well, some ancestor of mine or somebody who was of the same ethnic group as I am was killed by the Nazis, therefore I'm entitled to go take somebody else's land. It didn't even begin to be logical, and not to mention unfair and immoral and cruel. So I go back all the way to 1948 when that happened. And I remember that because Truman was running for president. My dad had been head of Status of Forces Prosecutions in Europe, handpicked by Truman. I met Truman in Indianapolis when my dad was the first assistant U.S. attorney. He introduced me to President Truman. So I was very aware, even at that tender age of 35, as to what was going on. So I wasn't really 35. In fact, this all happened 40 years before I was born. You would never believe that I minored in math. Well, I didn't minor in math. I minored in calculus. There's a difference. In calculus, you don't actually do the math. You do the formulas, not the math. Same thing in physics. Those of you who have degrees in physics, like I do, know what I'm talking about. Once you pass a certain level, you can stop thinking. You just come up with formulas which nobody else understands, so they give you an A. What was I even talking about? Oh yes, Israel. So there we are, and my family was not pleased at all with what was happening between the Arabs and the Jews, and they did not like what we had been doing, and they knew the reason we were doing it was because we were pouring billions and continue to pour billions of dollars into Israel because of CPAC. And it's like these people, not CPAC, the APAC, Arab-Israeli PAC, financed by the Israeli government, basically contributing equally to members of both parties and buying American political support to continue to give them money like we have never given to anybody else in history. So it's not because the American people think, we really need Israel. I've heard these arguments and they've been discredited all the time. I remember when General Braun came out and said, Israel is of zero strategic value to the United States. Who was General Braun? He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs at the time, and they hollered him down, and he backed off of it. He didn't actually reverse himself, he just backed off the subject. So, and I remember when that happened. I don't remember the year now, but I remember it happening at the time, and I said, that's what I thought. I didn't understand how they could be of such great strategic value to us, and then here you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying they're not, which is what I suspected all along. So here we are, and Trump is like right there. Because why? Because the Christians are right there. Why are the Christians right there? Because they love Israel. Because they love Jews? No, they hate Jews. You know that. Right-wingers everywhere hate Jews. Remember those guys with the parade in Virginia? Jews will not replace us with the torches. I never thought I'd see that day occur in the United States ever. And there they are, and those are conservatives. They hate Jews. But the Christians, somewhere in the Bible, the apocalypse, somewhere in the Bible they read that in the apocalypse, this is what's going to happen. Armageddon, that's the place I was trying to think of. On the battlefields of Armageddon, there's going to be this huge fight between the angels on the side of the Lord and the devil, and they're all going to fight at that battlefield. And then when it's over, all the Jews will be dead because they're bad guys because they're not Christians. The Christians will go to heaven, and the ones who are not Christians, which means Jews and everybody else, they're going straight to hell. That's what they believe. Honest to God, that's what these people believe. Look it up. I don't just say things. Go to Google. You can find this stuff. This is why the Christians, particularly in the deep biblical South, are such ardent supporters of Israel. They don't like Israel. They couldn't care less. They want Israel to be the place where Armageddon takes place, because Armageddon's in Israel, so that they can go to heaven. What about me going to heaven? I'm not a good Christian. I mean, if you don't believe me, you can ask Francois Pierre. He's a good Christian. Now, they couldn't care less. They couldn't care less about anybody except themselves. And they support Donald Trump, and Donald Trump supports. Here's what Donald Trump does. I'm going to digress for a minute. I know he's digressing again. Yes, I'm going to do that. Because I heard somebody the other day say, yeah, people are comparing Donald Trump to Hitler. I think it was Bill Maher that did that. I got issues with Bill Maher, whom I usually, think he's terrific, not recently. And this goes back to Israel. But, so, he says, hey, you should never compare Donald Trump to Hitler. Hitler belongs to the category. Yes, you can compare things that he does to things that Hitler did, particularly in the political arena. And one of the main things Hitler did was he found an unpopular minority, the Jews, and he used that unpopularity to stoke up the anger and therefore get the support of Germans, particularly right-wing Germans, conservative Germans, to get up their support and rile them against the Jews. And he said, look, you guys don't like Jews. I don't like Jews either. I'm on your side. And they said, yeah, we love Hitler. He speaks for us. And that's very similar to what Donald Trump is doing with the unpopular minorities of blacks and Hispanics. And these people, particularly in the rural South, the MAGA people, particularly young men, they really don't like black people. They really don't like brown people. They resent when they lose a job to a black person. They resent it when they see Hispanics coming in and setting up shop and having signs in Spanish that they can't read. They get really angry about that. So I see a parallel in terms of politics that Trump does to Hitler. And there are other things he did. Like, did you know that the Make America Great Again, that came right from Hitler's Make Germany Great Again. And then the silliness of his people going with these Nazi salutes. And anybody who's ever seen a war movie, and we've all seen them, Nazi salutes. That's what they do all over the place. These people are mimicking things that they got from Mein Kampf that Hitler used. And you should read that. You read the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's incredible the things that Hitler did and got away with, and it's amazing to see the parallels with Trump and his Trump people. It's amazing. Trump is a master politician when it comes to pulling those levers and getting people angry over things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I don't like, but I don't get mad about it, and I don't lose sight of the economics, which is where the real issues are. But these other people, they don't. He gets them fired up about those things, and then they think the Democrats are all in favor of these black people and these brown people taking over the country, just like in Germany. It was like, oh, these nationalists are all in favor of Germany being taken over by Jews. It's really analogous. So the reason I digress from that, but I'd like to come back to where I was, which is that's what's going on with these people in the Deep South, these preachers mainly, that are out there riling people up and saying, we've got to support Israel. They don't like the Jews, but they want us to support Israel because that's what's in the Bible, and these preachers use that to motivate their flock to go out there and vote Republican. And I've been watching this take place, as long as I can remember. I remember when the South was a solid Democratic South. And then these preachers got involved. And boy, they've just used that biblical thing, and then the Republicans all suddenly, where they were all like really moral. You mentioned Donald Trump as being the leader of the Christian morality in this country. Just think about how absurd that is. But that's where we are now. So it's like, going back to Israel, and the reason the thing that kind of got my juices flowing today was Peter Barnhardt. Well, who's Peter Barnhardt? Well, if you pay attention to columnists and people on his talk shows and all this stuff, which I do, which if you do that, you obviously have too much time in your hands. Peter Barnhardt is a Jew. Peter Barnhardt I didn't think of him as a young fellow, but now I do. He's got brown hair. Peter Barnhardt wrote a book, and it just recently came out, and it had something to do with what it's like to be a Jew. in the aftermath of the destruction of Gaza, something like that. And then I read an article by him in the New York Times today, talking about what's happening to American Jews, particularly students in universities who have taken part in, and often sometimes in conjunction with Arab students and sometimes by themselves, protesting what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I said, okay. And when I watched him on TV, I was talking about his book, and one of the things he said was, well, when I was growing up, it never occurred to me that there was anything other than in Israel, and that Israel was the the historical home place of the Jews, and they were just continuing to live there. And I went, that's what he thought growing up? Well, that's why I said I realized he's a lot younger than I thought. If he was my age, he would have grown up thinking that. But if he was like 10 years younger, then yeah, his whole life it was been Israel, and no question about it. They're there. It's a country. It's established. That it has an army. It has it has a Knesset. It has all these things. I said, Jesus, this is part of the problem with this country. We don't really educate people about even recent history. They get views about history from who knows where, but they don't get it. They don't get real history. And then you have to look to people like me, old timers, who've actually lived through it. Or me, I got a history. For example, my politics, my political views really go back to 1920, and what happened in 1920 forward. Right? Basically, the lead up to the Great Depression. I learned that from my parents, primarily my dad, who suffered tremendously in the Great Depression. I don't want to go into it, but it was heartbreaking. It's like. So I learned from people who lived through these things and talked about them. That's really how history gets taught, gets handed down. But for this fella who was a well-educated young Jewish fella, who was on all these talk shows, well known for his opinions, writing columns for the New York Times, to think that there had always been an Israel until recently. And suddenly he said, actually, something happened to open his eyes. I think it was this thing in Gaza, where he started really looking into the background and why is there all this conflict with Gaza? And then he finally realized what I was just telling you about how Israel came into existence as a modern nation. It didn't exist before 1948. And it was there really because so many people felt badly about what happened to the Jews in World War II, not thinking about whether it's morally right to make these Arabs, who had nothing to do with what Hitler did, make them pay the price. And that's when he started thinking, and this is what happens. You take somebody who is a good person, you give them information, you stimulate these little cells, and amazing things happen. He's written a book. I haven't read it, but I'm going to. And his position now is he has gone full circle, and he's really critical, as he should be, of Israel today and what Israel's doing to the people in Gaza. And what they're doing in Gaza is shoving these people, they've already done it, shoved them off into this tiny strip of land, treated it like almost like an open-air prison, the largest gulag in the country, in the world rather. And the people live in horrible conditions. Then you had this hideous thing with these people, this group of Hamas ran across there, did terrible things to a bunch of innocent people, mainly kids at a concert. And then, in return for that, the Jews then went in and basically destroyed Gaza. And I heard the other day they bombed the last remaining hospital there. So you've got these people that are just being slaughtered. Civilians being slaughtered, not Hamas. These are civilians being slaughtered. And the Gaza is basically being leveled. Remember when Trump in his infinite kindness and wisdom said, yeah, well, we can level this and have it can be like another Las Vegas, it'll be a great resort town. Like, well, what about the people that live there now? No. What about the buildings? What about the homes? What about the hospitals? What about the schools? Get rid of all that and we'll have a great big casino. Remember how successful I was in Ocean City, wherever the hell he was, Atlantic City? Yeah, that's what we'll do there. Yeah. Who cares about the people? In the meantime, while this is going on the West Bank, they've got settlers running in there, assaulting these people, the Arabs who are still living there in homes, bombing their homes, firebombing them, attacking them, doing everything they can to make their life a hell on earth so that they can drive them out of there as well, so that they can have the land from the river to the sea. And you hear people say, "Oh, that's the Palestinians talking about the river to the sea." It's also what the Israeli government is talking about, is the river to the sea. That's what Netanyahu's government envisions, is Israel from the river to the sea. Now let's talk a little bit about what happened when this October surprise, when Hamas broke over there, and it was a small group of people, mainly a bunch of little bastard kids in the back of pickup trucks with machine guns, killing innocent people. But it lasted. But here's the thing it's not been answered, and I have a theory. Is that this assault lasted, I think it was like 8 or 10 hours. 8 or 10 hours, you know how many Jewish soldiers came to rescue the people? No one. For hours this went on. No one in the Israeli army showed up. We also had information that Netanyahu was advised well in advance that this attack was going to take place. So you put the combination that, assuming I don't know for a fact, I don't know whether he was advised or not, but I know I've heard that and read that many places. I do know that nobody came from the Israeli government came to the rescue of those people for those many hours. No one. How many people were slaughtered by these vicious hoodlums, these criminals that came across from Gaza, and they are no way indicative of the people of Gaza. It's the people of Gaza that paid the price, not the people who killed those innocent kids in Israel. But how many people were killed during the time that the Israeli government didn't send its troops in? No one talks about that. The facts are there, but none of these talking heads talk about it. So those two questions, coupled with what Israel then did as a result of that attack, where they use that, in my opinion, as an excuse to go in there and basically destroy Gaza. And to me, that's what happened. There's no doubt in my mind that Netanyahu knew this was coming. He let it happen. He watched it happen. He intended to use it so he could use an excuse to go in there and kill those people, and that's what he's done, and that's what he's still doing to this day. It's off the headlines, but it's still happening. And thank God we've got people like Peter Barnhardt finally speaking out against it. You've had lots of Jews now appearing in this article today, and today is the 2nd of May, New York Times opinion piece. Get it and read it. It's shocking what what these universities are doing, what the government is doing to Jewish students who are protesting peacefully on the universities against the conduct of Israel. And look what they're doing to these Jewish students. Not just Arabs, Jewish students. And to me, the Jews in this country have always been the conscience, particularly the conscience of the Democratic Party. And to see the Jews who are speaking out appropriately about the horrible conduct of Netanyahu. Lots of good Germans who didn't speak out against Hitler. Am I comparing Netanyahu to Hitler? Yeah, kind of I am. So what? So what? The real issue is, what's Netanyahu done? What's Israel doing in his name? Why do the people of Israel allow this? And let's start giving credit and applause to the Jews in this country who are standing up for what's right. And Peter Barnhardt is one of those to me. He's my new hero. And his last name is spelled Bernhardt, Peter Barnhardt. And I've liked him for a long time anyway, because he's one of these people who speaks with common sense, and he's got good morals, good values. But read what he has to say. But if you're an American, and just because it's not on the news every day doesn't mean it's not happening, and doesn't mean that you have a right to just turn your back on and think about the price of eggs and butter and whatever other stuff Trump is causing to go up. Those things matter, I guess. As far as I'm concerned, just stop eating eggs, or worse, stop throwing them at cars. If you can't afford to throw eggs at cars, then you shouldn't be throwing anything at cars. Or maybe tomatoes. I don't know. I don't want to go there, and don't you take me there, because I don't want to get in this issue about what's the better thing to throw at cars. And the next thing you know, it's going to be, should we even throw anything at cars? And that's a ridiculous, even a thought. So, but the United States of America, we have a tendency, we have like a 2-second attention span, and then we're off to something else. Don't let these things slip away. What's going on over there is a disgrace, and we need to know what's going on. So those are my thoughts about that. Thanks to you, Peter Barnhardt. To my Jewish friends, don't be mad at me because I'm critical of Israel. I've been plenty critical of Ireland in my day. And just because you come from, or your ancestors, your great ancestors came from a country or people, doesn't mean that you have to support everything which the present day government of any country does, including this one, obviously. So that's all I have to say today. Sorry if I got wound up, and I hope I didn't bore you. A lot of people don't like all this history, but to me, if you know the old saying, if those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But more significantly, if you don't know history, you often don't understand what's going on today. You probably just don't understand it. That's why I take my political education, and I study history going all the way back to well before we were a country. Mainly because I'm curious. How did this happen? How did that happen? How did we get into this conflict? How did somebody get into this war? But for this country, in terms of its present, its modern politics, modern economics, modern history, starts in 1920. So learn your history. Study the Roaring '20s, not just for the dancing girls and and the illegal booze, the good old days, but for the economic perspective, because today's economics are Trump's economics are sadly reflective of the economics of Warren G. Harding, Herbert Hoover, and and Calvin Coolidge. So it's if you look at particularly the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. You've heard me talk about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Look them up again. Learn from history. Don't be bored by it. History is actually fascinating. Unfortunately, I got a bunch of idiots teaching this stuff. By and large, think about my history teachers. Unbelievable. Anyway, yeah, that's right. I was a smart aleck in high school, and I got in a lot of trouble. So what? You never did anything wrong? No, I forgot to whom I was speaking. All right, guys. I'll talk with you later. Please be patient with me. Sometimes I get too involved and worked up and stuff, but Peter Barnhardt inspired me. And hopefully you'll read about him, and maybe you'll get inspired too. Bye.